Magnus Crow slammed the ledger shut so hard the ink bottle jumped off the desk and shattered across the floor. "Find her," he said. His voice was quiet. That was the worst part. Men who screamed could be reasoned with. Magnus never screamed. The man standing across from him, Victor Kane, bounty hunter, wanted in 3 territories and feared in all of them, didn't move a muscle. He just waited. "She took something from me," Magnus said, straightening his cuffs like he was preparing for a dinner party, not ordering a hunt. "My recipes, my reputation, 10 years of work walking around in a fat woman's head." He finally looked up. "Bring her back, or don't bring her back at all. I don't care which." Victor nodded once, picked up his hat, and walked out into the cold. Well, before we go further, if stories like this are what you live for, hit that subscribe button right now. Every week we bring you tales of courage, grit, and the kind of people history forgot to celebrate. Drop your city or country in the comments below. I want to see exactly how far this story has traveled. And if you're still here at the end, leave a like. It means more than you know. Now, let's go back to where it all began. The supply wagon came down out of the gray sky like a bad omen. That was how Clem Dudley described it later, sitting by the stove with a tin cup warming his hands, trying to explain to anyone who'd listen what that morning had felt like. He said the wagon appeared out of the blizzard wall the way a ghost appears out of a wall. One moment, nothing, the next moment, something, and no logical explanation for either state. He was the one who spotted it first. He'd been posted at the fence line, not because anyone thought a supply wagon would actually make it up the mountain pass in that weather, but because Silas Granger had ordered someone posted there, and when Silas Granger gave an order, it happened. That was simply the nature of things at Iron Hollow Ranch. Clem squinted into the wind and watched the wagon slow to a stop just inside the gate. The 2 horses pulling it looked like they'd been through something close to war. Steam rose off their backs. Their legs were trembling. And then the figure on the bench seat climbed down. Clem blinked. He blinked again. He walked closer, boots crunching over the frozen crust of snow, and he stopped about 10 feet away because he genuinely didn't know what else to do. The figure standing beside that wagon was a woman. Not a young woman, not a small woman. A woman in her middle years with a wide frame and a set to her jaw that suggested she had not arrived here by accident. She wore a wool coat that had seen better decades. Her boots were practical and cracked at the seams. In one hand she held a battered leather satchel, and in the other, and this was the part Clem could never quite explain when he told the story, she held a cast-iron pot by the handle, carrying it like most people carry a handbag, like it was the most natural thing in the world. She looked at Clem and said, "I need to speak to whoever runs this place." Clem stared at her, then at the pot, then back at her face. "Ma'am," he said carefully, "this is a cattle ranch." "I know what it is," she said. "My name is Miriam Holloway. I'm the new cook." There was a silence that lasted about 3 full seconds. Then Clem turned around and walked back toward the main house as fast as his legs would carry him, because whatever happened next was absolutely not his problem to solve. Silas Granger was in the middle of arguing with his foreman, Dutch Reardon, about the condition of the south barn roof when Clem came through the door. The argument was the kind that had been running for 3 weeks, low, grinding, like a wheel with a stone caught in it. The roof was collapsing in sections. Dutch wanted to pull men off cattle rotation to fix it. Silas refused because he couldn't spare the bodies. And around they went, 2 men who respected each other too much to quit and disagreed too fundamentally to agree. Dutch was mid-sentence when Clem came in. Silas looked at him. "What?" Silas said. Not a question. More like a statement of intent. "The supply wagon got here," Clem said. Silas's expression shifted by about a millimeter, which, for him, was the equivalent of a relieved smile. He needed those supplies. The men had been eating half rations for going on 9 days, and 3 of them were already showing the hollowed-out look that came before sickness. "Good," he said. "Tell them to unload at the—" "There's also a woman," Clem said. Dutch stopped talking. Silas's expression did not shift this time. "Come again." "A woman. She says she's the cook you sent for." Clem hesitated. "She's got a pot." The room was quiet for a moment. I sent for an experienced camp cook, Silas said slowly. A man named Garrett, Elliot Garrett. I paid for Elliot Garrett. Clem shrugged helplessly. Well, there's a woman out there. Silas looked at Dutch. Dutch looked at the ceiling. Then Silas picked up his coat from the hook, pulled it on in one motion, and walked out through the door into the cold. Miriam was still standing where Clem had left her. She had not retreated to the wagon. She had not stamped her feet against the cold or pulled her coat tighter or done any of the small, anxious things that people do when they're waiting to be judged. She just stood there in the wind, her hand wrapped around the handle of that pot, her eyes steady. She saw Silas coming across the yard, and she read him immediately. The way a person reads weather. The broad shoulders, the deliberate walk, the face that had been arranged into something permanent and unpleasant by a long succession of hard years. He was the kind of man who believed that his expression told you everything you needed to know about him before he opened his mouth. He stopped 6 feet away from her. She waited. He looked at her, then at the pot. Then he said, "Who sent you?" "Garrison Supply out of Denver," she said. "Elliot Garrett broke his leg 2 days before departure. They sent me instead." "They didn't ask me," Silas said. "No," Miriam said. "They didn't. So you know I didn't agree to this." "I know." "Then why," he said, "are you still standing in my yard instead of turning that wagon around?" Miriam looked at him without blinking. "Because it took 3 days to get up that pass, Mr. Granger." "Mr. Granger, because the temperature up here is 20 below and falling, because your men haven't had a proper meal since before that last storm hit. I know that because I can see it on the driver who brought me up. He spent 2 days at your last supply stop, and he said your ranch hands looked half dead." She paused. "And because I can cook, better than Elliot Garrett ever could. He told me so himself." Silas stared at her. "He said that," Silas said flatly. "He said that," Miriam said, "right before he told me to watch out for the ice at mile marker 9. He was a decent man. Genuinely poor balance." Something moved behind Silas's eyes. It was gone before it became anything. "You find this funny," he said. "I find it cold," she said. "And I'd like to start a fire." He didn't send her back. Not that moment. He also didn't invite her in. What he did was stand there in the wind for another 10 seconds, long enough to make his position clear, long enough to let her understand that this was his mountain and his decision. And then he said, 1 hour. Miriam tilted her head slightly. 1 hour, he repeated. The kitchen's through that door on the left. You've got whatever's on that wagon and whatever's been left behind in there, which I'll warn you is not much, and most of it has turned. He put his hands in his coat pockets. You put a meal in front of my men in 1 hour that's worth eating, you can stay the season. You don't. I put you back on that wagon, and you go down the mountain tonight. Tonight, Miriam said. Tonight. She looked up at the sky. The clouds were already that deep, bruised color that meant more snow before dark. Going down that pass tonight would be, well, it would be what it would be. All right, she said. She looked at him one more time, and then she walked past him toward the door he'd indicated, cast iron pot swinging at her side. Silas watched her go. Dutch appeared at his elbow. She's not going to make it, Dutch said quietly. I was in that kitchen yesterday. There's nothing worth cooking in there. Silas said nothing. What are you going to do if she actually pulls something together? Dutch asked. Silas turned and walked back toward the barn. She won't, he said, but he said it one beat too slow. E.T. The kitchen was worse than Miriam had let herself imagine. She stood in the doorway for exactly 5 seconds. She allowed herself 5 seconds to absorb something before she acted on it. And then she walked in and got to work. The previous cook, whatever his name had been, had apparently given up on the concept of organization sometime around October. Supplies were stacked without logic. Several things had frozen and cracked their containers. There was a sack of flour in the corner that had gotten wet and then dried into a single solid mass that might technically still be flour in places, if you were optimistic about it. She found dried beans. She found salt pork that had gone questionable but not unrecoverable. She'd dealt with worse, she'd dealt with far worse. She found onions that had shriveled but not rotted, which meant their flavor had concentrated rather than died. She found cornmeal. She found a small cache of dried chilies hanging from a nail that she almost missed in the bad light. And when she found them, she allowed herself the smallest exhale, because that changed things. She found bear grease. She found a cast iron Dutch oven that hadn't been properly seasoned in months and was beginning to rust in the seams. She built a fire in the stove with the efficiency of someone who had done it 10,000 times in 10,000 different circumstances. She sorted, and she assessed, and she moved, and she did not stop moving, because stopping was the enemy, and she knew it. While the salt pork rendered in the pan, she soaked nothing. There was no time to soak. But she scored the beans and crushed them slightly in a cloth, which she'd learned from a woman in Missouri 20 years ago, a woman whose name she still remembered, a woman who'd told her that patience was a luxury and skill was the substitute. "You work with what time gives you," that woman had said. "You don't wait for better circumstances. You make the circumstances better." She made the onions go into the fat, and she let them sit there until they went translucent and then past translucent into something deep and amber and sweet. The dried chilies she crumbled in by hand, releasing the oils. She added the beans with enough water to produce a thick working broth, not a thin soup. She added the salt pork back in chunks. She added a small amount of the cornmeal as a thickener, which was a trick she'd developed herself and never written down because she didn't need to. The kitchen began to smell like something. Then it began to smell like something real. Clem smelled it first. He was passing by the building with an armload of firewood when it hit him. This wave of warmth and something rich and deep, something that reached into a part of his brain that had nothing to do with thought and everything to do with memory. He stopped walking. He stood there holding firewood in the cold and breathed in through his nose. Then he put the wood down against the wall and went to find the others. They came to the kitchen door in groups of 2 and 3, the way cattle drift toward a water source, not rushing, not wanting to seem like they were rushing, but moving steadily and inevitably in one direction. By the time the hour was up, 11 men were standing in various positions around the kitchen door. Some were leaning against the wall. Some were just standing in the yard in the cold, looking at the door. Miriam filled bowls. She did not make a ceremony of it. She didn't stand up straight and announce anything, or make them understand what she'd done, or explain the limitations she'd worked within. She just filled bowls and set them out. The first man who ate, a young hand named Percy, who was 17 and had been sick for a week and hadn't had an appetite in days, took one spoonful, stopped, and looked down at the bowl. Then he looked up. Then he took another spoonful. Nobody spoke. In a room full of hungry men, the silence was more powerful than anything that could have been said. Silas came in at the back. He told himself he wasn't going to eat it. He was going to assess it the way he assessed everything else, with clear eyes and no sentiment. He was going to determine whether the men seemed satisfied, whether the portion management was reasonable, whether the kitchen had been left in a workable state. Those were the objective measures. He didn't need to taste anything to make a professional judgment. He picked up a bowl anyway. He didn't know why. He told himself it was to check consistency, to verify the temperature, something like that. He stood apart from the men, near the back wall, and he brought the spoon to his mouth. What happened next was not something he could have predicted or defended. The taste hit him, and something cracked open in the center of his chest, something he'd had sealed shut for so long that he'd stopped believing it was there. It was the beans. It was the way the chilies had been handled. It was something in the depth of the broth that he could not have named if someone held a gun to his head, but that he knew, with his whole body, from somewhere much older than memory. His mother had made something like this. Not the same, not identical, but close enough that the gap between them felt unbearable rather than comforting. She'd been gone for 23 years. He'd buried her himself in frozen ground, and then gone back to work the next morning, because there was nothing else to do, and nobody else to do it. And sentiment was a thing you swallowed and kept walking. He stood with a spoon in his hand in the back of that kitchen and felt 23 years lurch sideways. He set the bowl down before he finished it. He turned and walked out without a word. None of the men saw his face. He made sure of that. Miriam was washing the Dutch oven when she heard the door close behind him. She had not watched him eat. She had made a point of not watching anyone eat, because people ate differently when they were being observed, and she wanted them to eat without thinking about it. But she'd known he was there. She'd known when he came in, and she'd known when he left, and the length of time in between told her something. She finished washing the pot and dried her hands on the cloth and stood for a moment in the kitchen, which was warmer now than it had been when she arrived. The fire in the stove was steady. The smell of food had settled into the walls in the way that smells settle into old wood. Not temporary, but layered, like something that meant to stay. Outside, she could hear the wind picking up again. The blizzard that had been threatening all day was finally making good on its promise. Miriam looked at the kitchen door, thought about Silas Granger walking back across the yard in that wind, and felt something complicated move through her. Not quite pity, not quite understanding, but something in between that she didn't have a name for yet. Then she went to check on the fire and started thinking about breakfast. She did not know, standing there in that cold kitchen at the top of the world, that the man hunting her had already left Denver. She did not know that Victor Kane rode faster in winter than in summer because the cold focused him. She did not know that someone at the supply depot, someone who'd seen her name on the manifest, someone who carried a long-running grievance and a short memory for loyalty, had already sent a message south. She knew none of that yet. What she knew was beans and fire and the sound of wind against the walls. For now, that was enough to work with. She was up before anyone else. That was the first thing the men noticed, not on that first morning, but by the third day, when it became undeniable. Before the sun had any intention of rising, before even the horses had started their restless shifting in the barn, there was already a light moving behind the kitchen window, a small orange glow, steady and deliberate, like something that knew exactly what it was doing. Percy noticed it first because Percy couldn't sleep. The sickness had left him, mostly, but it had left behind a restlessness that kept him awake in the hours before dawn, staring at the bunkhouse ceiling and listening to 11 men breathe at different rhythms. On the third night, he gave up trying and pulled on his boots and coat and stepped outside into the cold. And there it was, that light. He stood there in the dark for a moment, watching it. Then, because he was 17 and still operated on instinct more than judgment, he walked toward it. Miriam didn't look up when he came through the kitchen door. She was working dough on the floured board. Not gently, not carefully, but with the focused aggression of someone who understood that bread required a certain amount of force to become what it needed to be. "Sit down if you're going to stand there," she said. Percy sat. "You should be sleeping," she added. "Couldn't," he said. She didn't respond to that. She just kept working the dough, folding and pressing with the heel of her hand, turning it a quarter turn, folding again. The rhythm of it filled the kitchen. After a while, Percy said, "What are you making?" "Bread. Biscuits for breakfast. Beans are already on." She nodded toward the stove where the Dutch oven sat, its lid slightly ajar, a thin thread of steam rising from the gap. Percy looked at it. "You never really stop, do you?" Miriam was quiet for a moment. "Stopping is expensive," she said finally. "Can't always afford it." That was all she said about it. Percy didn't ask more, but he sat there in the warmth of that kitchen for another hour, not talking, just being present in the same space as someone who was working, and found that it helped his restlessness more than sleep would have. He was not the last one to discover that the kitchen, in the hours before dawn, was the quietest and most bearable place on the mountain. Silas noticed the light, too. He noticed it from his window on the second floor of the main house, where he kept odd hours because he slept badly and always had. He noticed it and turned away from it and told himself it was not his concern. He had not spoken to Miriam Holloway since the night he walked out of the kitchen without finishing his bowl. He had communicated through Dutch, which was how he handled most things he didn't want to deal with directly. Dutch told her the supply inventory. Dutch told her the meal schedule. Dutch relayed whatever she needed from Silas and relayed back whatever Silas needed to know. It was a workable system. Silas was good at workable systems. What he was less good at was the fact that every meal she produced landed on him like something he hadn't prepared for. Not because the food was extraordinary, though it was, consistently, with materials that should not have produced anything worth eating. It was something underneath the food, some quality he couldn't name and refused to examine too closely. On the fifth morning, she made biscuits with rendered bear fat and dried rosemary she'd found in a cracked jar at the back of the pantry shelf. She'd coaxed cornmeal into something almost sweet with a careful hand and timing. The men ate in a silence that was not the silence of indifference, but the silence of people who don't want to interrupt something good. Silas ate at the separate table he always used, slightly apart from the men, because he believed in the visible distinction between owner and employee and maintained it without apology. He ate 3 biscuits. He was aware of eating 3 biscuits. He was aware that this was 2 more than he normally allowed himself at a meal, and he did not fully understand it, and that bothered him more than the biscuits themselves. The first real test came at the end of the second week. 2 of the ranch hands came down sick at the same time, not the drifting, appetite-killing sickness that Percy had weathered, but something harder and faster, fever and chills, and a cough that sounded like something breaking. Their names were Walt and a man everyone called Briggs, and by the second day they couldn't get out of their bunks. Dutch told Silas. Silas told Dutch to move them to the side room off the main house where it was warmer and separate from the others. Then he went back to his accounts. He assumed that was the end of his involvement. He did not account for Miriam. She appeared at the side room door that same afternoon with a pot of something, not the usual stew, something thinner and sharper smelling, with an edge that suggested purpose rather than pleasure. She had no official authority to be nursing anyone. No one had asked her. She had simply assessed the situation as a problem she was capable of addressing and moved toward it. Walt watched her come through the door with the suspicious expression of a man who has been sick enough to distrust well-meaning intervention. "What's that?" he said. "Broth," she said. "Ginger and willow bark and whatever the previous cook left in that jar that smelled medicinal. Drink it." "I'm not drinking something that smells like—" "You're going to drink it," she said pleasantly, "or you're going to keep feeling the way you feel right now. Those are your options." Walt drank it. Briggs, who had been watching this exchange with the detached interest of a man too feverish to have strong opinions, accepted his cup without argument. She came back that evening. She came back the next morning. She sat with them in a way that was not sentimental. She wasn't there to hold hands or offer comfort in any traditional sense. She was there to monitor, to adjust, to make small practical decisions. She brought different things at different times. She changed the damp cloths on their foreheads with the efficiency of someone who had done it before. In other places, for other people. On the 3rd day, Walt's fever broke. On the 4th day, Briggs sat up and ate solid food for the first time. Dutch told Silas. Silas said, "Good." Then he said, "She had any training, medical?" "Don't think so," Dutch said. "I think she just knows things." Silas thought about that for a moment. "What kinds of things?" Dutch shrugged. "The kind you learn when nobody's there to help you and you have to figure it out yourself." Silas didn't respond to that, but that evening, for the first time, he walked past the kitchen door and paused there for a moment. Not going in, just pausing. And through the door, he could hear her moving around in there, the sound of the pot against the stove grate, the sound of a spoon against iron. Small domestic sounds that had no business cutting through a person the way they did. He walked on. No. The blizzard that hit at the end of the 3rd week was the worst of the season. It came down from the north with the kind of committed fury that makes you understand why people used to build their stories around weather. Not as backdrop, not as atmosphere, but as antagonist. A genuine, purposeful force that wanted something and would not be redirected. For 48 hours, nobody left the buildings unless they had to. And even then, they tied a rope between the house and wherever they were going because the whiteout made 10 feet of distance equivalent to lost. The men were confined inside together for 2 full days, which under normal circumstances produced the kind of friction that occasionally turned into something that needed to be settled outside. Tempers ran short. Old grievances found new oxygen. Clem and a man named Harker had been carrying a cold hostility between them since October over something nobody could quite remember anymore, and confined quarters brought it to a simmer. Miriam felt it before it became anything. She'd been watching people in small spaces long enough to read the pressure. The way Clem stopped sitting on one side of the common room. The way Harker's jaw did something particular when Clem spoke. The particular silence that surrounded the two of them in a space that was otherwise full of noise. What she did about it was not what anyone expected. She walked into the common room on the second day of the blizzard with a pot of coffee. Real coffee, which had been rationed carefully for 3 weeks. And she sat down between the two men and she started talking. Not about them. Not about the tension. She started talking about a mining camp in Colorado where she'd worked for a season, and a dispute there between two men over a card game that had somehow expanded to encompass every grudge and slight either of them had ever carried, until the whole camp was divided into factions and the original card game had been completely forgotten. She told the story the way she told most things, plainly, without performance, with just enough detail to make it real. She made the two men in that story specific enough to be almost familiar. The punchline, such as it was that the two men had eventually been forced to work together to pull a mule out of a mud pit, and by the time the mule was out, neither of them could quite remember what they'd been so committed to staying angry about. Clem laughed first. Then Harker, reluctantly, around the edges of his mouth. Neither of them looked at each other. But something shifted. Dutch, sitting across the room, watched the whole thing happen and said nothing. Later he told Percy that he'd seen foremen try to manage bunkhouse tensions for 30 years, and he'd never seen it done that cleanly or that quietly. She didn't fix anything, he said. She just loosened something, like when a rusted bolt finally moves. Percy nodded like he understood, because he was beginning to. On the night the blizzard finally broke, Silas came to the kitchen. Not through Dutch, not with a question relayed through someone else. He came himself, in the late evening when the wind had finally dropped to something bearable, and he knocked on the kitchen door, which surprised even him because it was his own building on his own property, and knocking was something he generally considered a waste of time. Miriam called him in. She was at the table with a cup of something not working for once. The kitchen was clean. Not performatively clean, but the kind of clean that happens when someone has a system and maintains it without having to think about it. The stove had been banked for the night. There was a quiet in the room that felt earned. Silas stood inside the door for a moment. He was not a man who struggled for words. He had opinions, and he stated them, and that was generally the end of the conversation. But standing in that kitchen with the banked stove and the clean table, he found that what he wanted to say and what he knew how to say were two different things, and the gap between them was wider than he'd realized. He settled for, "Walton Briggs are back on rotation." "I know," she said. "I saw them at breakfast." A silence. "You didn't have to do that," he said. "The nursing." Miriam looked at him. "I know. It wasn't in any arrangement we made." "No," she said. "It wasn't." He waited as though she would say something more, some explanation, some reason for the extra labor she'd taken on without being asked. She didn't offer one. He pulled out the chair across from her and sat down. It was not a graceful movement. It was a man sitting down in a chair with the self-consciousness of someone who is not entirely sure why he's doing it. "Where were you before here?" he said. She considered the question, not as though she was deciding whether to answer, but as though she was choosing which version of the answer was the right one for this moment. "Different places," she said. "Denver, mostly, for the last few years. Before that, further east. Working as a cook." "Yes." "Always?" She turned her cup slowly between her palms. "Not always. There was a period when I was working differently, more formally, developing menus, teaching technique, that kind of work." She paused. It didn't last. Silas heard the careful, neutral tone she used for that last sentence and recognized it because he used the same tone for his own particular closed doors. The tone that said, "This subject has walls, and I have built them deliberately, and I am not inviting you in." He didn't push. Instead, he said, "The men are calling you the soul of this place." He said it flatly, like he was relaying information, but he was watching her face when he said it. Something moved across her expression. Not quite embarrassment and not quite pleasure. Something more complicated than either. "The men are calling me someone who can make beans taste like something," she said. "That's not all it is," Silas said. and then seemed slightly surprised that he'd said it. Miriam looked at him across the table. This man who knocked on his own kitchen door, who ate his biscuits apart from everyone else and called it principle, who had walked out of the room the first night she cooked rather than let anyone see whatever had crossed his face. "No," she said quietly. "I suppose it isn't." The stove ticked in the silence. Outside, the temperature was dropping again, but the wind had gone somewhere else for the night. "Your mother," Miriam said, and then stopped. Silas went very still. "I don't know that it's the same thing I made," she said carefully. "I don't know what she made or how she made it, but sometimes food carries the shape of something, even when everything else is different." The stillness in Silas lasted another 3 seconds. Then he stood up. He pushed the chair back to where it had been, straightening it slightly as though the precision mattered. "Good night, Mrs. Holloway," he said. "Miss," she said, "and good night." He walked to the door and stopped there for a moment without turning around. "Holloway," he said. Not quite a question. "Yes." "That meal," he said. He stopped again. He was not going to finish the sentence, and they both knew it. He went out into the cold. Miriam sat alone in the kitchen and breathed. 3 weeks passed, then 4. Something had shifted in the structure of the ranch in ways that were difficult to name because they hadn't happened all at once. They had accumulated the way snow accumulates, not in a single event, but in 1,000 small layerings until one day you look and the landscape has completely changed. The men ate better, which meant they worked harder, which meant less was going wrong. Silas noticed the reduction in small mechanical failures, the reduction in the low-grade resentment that crept into exhausted men like a damp cold. He didn't connect it directly to the kitchen because Silas was the kind of man who attributed improvements to discipline and weather, not to cooking. But Dutch connected it. Dutch had been running cattle operations for 20 years, and he understood what hungry, miserable men looked like versus what men looked like when they were being maintained properly. "She's running a tighter ship than half the foremen I've worked under," he told Silas, "and she's doing it without anyone noticing she's doing it." Silas said, "She's a cook." "She's something," Dutch said, with the careful diplomacy of a man who has learned when not to argue with his employer. The men had started coming to Miriam with things. Small things at first. Percy asking about a rash on his forearm that had been bothering him. Clem asking if she knew anything about a horse that wouldn't eat. It wasn't that she had answers to everything. It was that she listened with the particular quality of attention that made people feel the thing they were saying was worth saying. Then larger things. Parker, who rarely spoke more than 10 words in a row to anyone, sat down in the kitchen one afternoon and told her, at some length and with visible discomfort, about a sister he hadn't contacted in 4 years, following an argument he could no longer fully reconstruct. He did not ask for advice. He seemed to simply need somewhere to put the story where it could exist outside of himself for a little while. Miriam listened. When he was done, she said, 4 years is a long time to be angry about something you can't fully remember. Parker sat with that for a moment. Then he got up and went back to work. 2 days later, Percy saw him at the supply depot desk, writing something on paper with the concentrated effort of a man who does not write often. But underneath all of it, underneath the meals and the nursing and the quiet management of a dozen rough men, Miriam carried something. She was careful about it. She was practiced at being careful about it. But there were moments when a new face appeared at the ranch's lower gate, or when a rider appeared on the ridge above the property, that her hands stopped whatever they were doing and she went very still in a particular way. Dutch noticed. He noticed most things, though he kept the inventory of what he noticed mostly to himself. One afternoon he came into the kitchen when she was standing at the window, looking out at the road that came down from the North Pass. Her hands were still. Her face had taken on an expression he hadn't seen before. Not fear, exactly, but something adjacent to it. Something that had been living inside her long enough to have worn a comfortable groove. Dutch got himself a cup of coffee and said, casually, facing the stove, "You running from something?" It was not a question, particularly, more like an observation placed in the room for her to do with as she chose. A long pause. "Isn't everyone?" she said. Some more urgently than others, Dutch said. Another pause. I had a situation, she said carefully, in Denver, with a former employer. She stopped. Then she said, It's being managed. Dutch looked at her. She met his eyes. He nodded once, the way a man nods when he decides to accept an answer that isn't complete, but is the best one available. Well, he said, you're on Silas Granger's mountain now. He picked up his cup and walked to the door. That counts for something. Miriam watched him go. What she didn't say, what she couldn't say, not yet, not to anyone, was that being on Silas Granger's mountain was not necessarily the same as being safe. That safety was a specific thing, a legal thing, a thing built from documents and witnesses, and the kind of evidence that held up in places where power was formally exercised. That the man who was looking for her had enough money to reach anyone, anywhere, and enough cruelty to make reaching them unpleasant. That she had been careful, but careful had limits. That the supply depot in Denver, where her name had appeared on a manifest, was not the secret she'd hoped it was. She didn't say any of that. She turned back to the stove and checked the lid on the pot and made a small adjustment to the fire. The road from the North Pass was empty. For now. It was Silas himself who noticed the change in her on the morning it mattered. He'd developed, without acknowledging that he'd developed it, a kind of peripheral awareness of Miriam's movements within the ranch. He told himself it was the same general awareness he maintained about all working parts of the operation. This was not entirely convincing, but he didn't examine it. What he noticed on that particular morning was that she'd burned the edge of the cornbread. This had not happened before. In 5 weeks of meals produced under genuinely difficult circumstances, not a single thing had come out wrong on the fundamental level. Adjusted, improvised, stretched beyond what it should reasonably have been, yes, but not wrong. The burned edge was small. Most men didn't notice. Those who did assumed the stove had run hot. Silas looked at Miriam's face when she brought it out and saw something there he recognized. The slightly flattened expression of someone who is managing something internal that requires most of their available attention, leaving only a fraction for the task in front of them. He'd worn that expression himself for years after his mother died. He knew it from the inside. After breakfast, he found Dutch. Has anything come up on the road recently? He said. Anyone passing through? Dutch looked at him. Not that I know of. Why? Silas said, keep an eye on the North Pass approach. Dutch started to ask why again, then stopped himself. How careful do you want the eye to be? Careful enough, Silas said. He went back to his work. He had accounts to settle and a south barn roof that was still a problem and a cattle rotation that needed rethinking for the spring thaw. He had an actual ranch to run, actual concerns, actual responsibilities that didn't include whatever was happening with the woman who burned one edge of the cornbread on a Tuesday morning. But he told Dutch to watch the pass. And that evening, without being sure why, he checked that the rifle above the fireplace was loaded. It was. He left it there. The night outside the window was very dark, and the road that came down from the north was too far away to see. And somewhere down that road, in a direction and at a distance that Miriam had not shared with anyone, something was moving. She could feel it the way you feel weather before it arrives. The pressure change. The particular quality of quiet before a loud thing happens. She lay in the small room off the kitchen that had become hers and looked at the ceiling and went through it all again. The plan she had been building since Denver, the plan she hoped she would never need, the plan that she had told herself over and over was enough. In the dark, with the wind pushing against the walls of Iron Hollow Ranch, she was slightly less certain that it was. But morning came, as it always did, and Miriam Holloway got up and built the fire and started the coffee and kept going. Because that was what you did when stopping was too expensive. You kept going. And you waited to see what came down the road. The man who betrayed her was not someone anyone would have suspected, which was, Miriam supposed, exactly the point. His name was Dillard, Roy Dillard. He had worked at Iron Hollow Ranch for 2 seasons before Miriam arrived, and he had left, or been asked to leave, depending on who was telling the story, sometime in late October, 3 weeks before the first big snow. The official reason, filtered through Dutch's careful language, was that Dellard had problems with authority. The unofficial reason, which Percy would tell you if you got him talking, was that Dellard had problems with being told he was wrong, and at Iron Hollow, those two things were essentially the same problem. He'd gone down the mountain with a bedroll and a grievance, and he'd found his way eventually to a town called Bitter Creek, which sat at the base of the eastern approach to the range and existed primarily to serve people who were traveling somewhere else. He worked at the livery for a while. He drank more than was useful. He told his story, his version of his story, to anyone who would listen, which in a town like Bitter Creek meant anyone who was also drinking. What nobody at the ranch knew was that Dellard had been in Bitter Creek the day Miriam's supply wagon passed through on its way up the mountain. He'd seen her name on the manifest. He hadn't known it meant anything. But 3 weeks later, when a tall man in a gray coat came through Bitter Creek, asking quiet questions about a woman traveling alone toward the high range, a woman of a particular description answering to a particular name, Dellard's memory had done the arithmetic before his conscience had time to vote. The man in the gray coat paid well. He paid in the kind of money that didn't leave a record. Dellard took it. He told himself it was just information. That information wasn't the same as action, that whatever happened next had nothing to do with him. Men tell themselves a great many things when they want the money more than the principle. Victor Kane had been working for Magnus Crow for 11 days by the time he arrived in Bitter Creek, and he was already tired of the man. This was unusual. Victor Kane was a professional, and professionals did not allow personal feelings about their employers to color the work. He had worked for worse people than Magnus Crow. He had done worse things than find a woman who didn't want to be found. He had a long and carefully managed accounting system in his head that distinguished between what he did for money and what he was as a person. And he kept the columns separate with the discipline of a man who understood that blurring them was the road to a particular kind of self-destruction. But Magnus Crow had a quality that wore on Victor in ways he found difficult to categorize. It was the smallness of him, not physical. Magnus was a large man, broad through the chest, the kind of man who occupied space with intention. The smallness was somewhere else. It was in the way he talked about Miriam Holloway. Not with anger, which Victor would have understood. Anger was a recognizable emotion with recognizable parameters, but with the particular contempt of a man who genuinely could not understand why someone he considered beneath him had become a problem. She was a cook. She was a woman without resources, without legal standing, without anyone powerful enough to matter standing behind her. The fact that she had managed to be inconvenient to him for this long had transformed his contempt into something that sat closer to obsession, and the obsession had an ugliness to it that Victor, after 11 days, found himself wanting to be done with. He did the job. That was who he was. He took Dellard's information. He confirmed the route, the timeline, the description of the ranch. He asked about the man who ran the place, Silas Granger, because Victor Kane did not walk into situations without knowing who was standing in them. What he learned about Silas Granger gave him pause. Not the stories about his temper, which Victor discounted. Every man in the territories had stories about tempers attached to his name, and half of them were inflation. Not the stories about the ranch's reputation for being difficult to approach. What gave him pause was simpler than that. It was that Silas Granger was the kind of man who had built something and knew what it had cost him. And men like that had a particular way of responding to threats that made them unpredictable. Predictable men were manageable. Unpredictable men got people killed. Victor spent an extra day in Bitter Creek thinking it through. Then he rode north. The road up to Iron Hollow in February was not a road that welcomed travelers. It was technically a road in the sense that someone had once cleared a path wide enough for a wagon, and that path was still theoretically there beneath 4 feet of packed snow and ice. In practice, it was a narrow argument between the mountain and anyone foolish enough to challenge it. The footing was bad. The switchbacks were sharper than they looked. The drop on the eastern side was the kind of drop that didn't leave witnesses. Victor Kane made the climb in a day and a half, which was either impressive or reckless, depending on your perspective. He had a good horse, and he knew how to read ice, and he moved with the methodical patience of someone who was being paid enough that the destination justified the approach. He arrived at the outer fence line of Iron Hollow Ranch at mid-morning on a Tuesday. Percy was at the fence line. Percy saw the man on the horse from 40 yards out. and felt something he couldn't immediately name, a shift in the air, a change in the quality of quiet, the way the mountains sometimes got very still right before something happened. The rider moved with a stillness that most people couldn't manage on horseback in that terrain. He sat the saddle like weather, like something that had settled in and intended to stay. Percy stood his ground, which took more effort than he would later admit. The rider stopped 10 yards from the fence. "This Iron Hollow Ranch," the man said. Not a question. "It is," Percy said. "I need to speak to whoever's in charge." Percy looked at him. At the coat, which was good quality but road-worn. At the rifle in the scabbard, which was not a working man's weapon. It was something more specific, more intentional. At the face, which was weathered and still and gave away absolutely nothing. "What's your business?" Percy said. "That's between me and whoever's in charge," the man said pleasantly. There was a politeness to it that was worse somehow than aggression. Percy had dealt with aggressive men. Aggressive men could be read. This man's politeness had a sealed quality, like a box you couldn't find the opening to. "Wait here," Percy said. He walked back to the main house as quickly as he could without running, because running would mean he'd been scared, and he wasn't going to be the person who ran. Accent. Silas was at the desk in his office when Percy knocked. Percy told him, in approximately 40 words, what was at the gate. The number of words was notable because Percy had a tendency to take longer. The compression told Silas something. Silas put down his pen. He took the rifle from beside the door, not the one above the fireplace, his working rifle, the one that lived within arm's reach, and he walked outside. He did not tell Dutch. He did not call anyone. He walked alone to the fence line because whatever was at his gate was something he was going to see for himself before he made any decisions about it. Victor Kane had not moved. He was still sitting the horse exactly where Percy had left him, with the patience of a man who has learned that patience is a kind of pressure, applied correctly. Silas stopped at the fence. The two men looked at each other. Silas had met enough dangerous men in his life to know one when he saw one, and what he was looking at now was the particular kind of dangerous that came from training rather than anger. Anger made men dangerous the way a loose fire made a room dangerous. Bright, obvious, likely to burn itself out. This was something colder, more considered. "Granger," the man said. "That's right," Silas said. "Victor Kane." He didn't offer a hand. The fence between them made it natural enough. "I'm looking for a woman, name of Miriam Holloway. I have reason to believe she's working on this property." Silas was quiet for a moment. "Who sent you?" he said. "A private employer. This is a civil matter. A contractual dispute. No law involved. No warrants. I'm just here to bring the woman back to Denver to sort out the details." Kane's voice was reasonable, measured. "Simple as that." "Simple," Silas said. "Yes, sir." Silas looked at him, at the rifle, at the second sidearm that was just barely visible under the left side of the coat, at the way the horse had been managed, the careful positioning, angled slightly so that Kane's draw side was not against the fence. "I don't have anyone here by that name," Silas said. Kane nodded slowly, as though he'd expected this answer. "Mr. Granger, I appreciate loyalty. It's a quality I respect. But my employer has significant resources, and this matter is going to be resolved one way or another. It would be better for your ranch, for your men, and for the woman herself if she came down voluntarily." "And if I tell you to turn that horse around," Silas said. Kane held his gaze for a moment. "Then I'd ask you to reconsider," he said, "and I'd wait while you did." Silas looked at him for another 3 seconds. Then he said, "You'll wait at the gate. You won't come past this fence, and you'll understand that there are 11 men on this property who will be watching you wait." He turned and walked back to the main house. He did not hurry. He was not going to hurry on his own property in front of that man, but his mind was moving fast. He found Miriam in the kitchen. Of course she was in the kitchen. She was always in the kitchen. She looked up when he came in, and she read his face in the way she read everything, quickly, completely, drawing conclusions before most people had finished looking. "He's here," she said. It was not a question. Silas stopped. "You knew someone was coming?" "I thought someone might," she said. She set down the spoon she'd been holding. Her hands were steady, and Silas noticed that her hands were steady, and he wasn't sure if that made him feel better or worse. How many? One man. Victor Kane, see, you know the name? Something crossed her face. Yes. Tell me. She was quiet for a moment, and in that moment Silas could see the calculation happening. Not whether to tell him, but how much and in what order, and what the telling would cost her. Magnus Crow sent him, she said. Magnus owns. He built his hotel empire on the back of my work. My recipes, my systems, my 10 years of development. He took them, put his name on them, and when I tried to establish that they were mine, he threatened me. When threatening didn't work, she stopped. Kane is what comes after threatening. Silas looked at her. What does Kane do? She met his eyes. He makes problems disappear. The kitchen was very quiet. And the ledger, Silas said. He'd heard enough frontier stories to know there was usually something, a piece of evidence, a document, something that made the situation more than a simple dispute. Do you have anything on Crow? Anything that would stop him? Miriam was quiet for one beat longer than she should have been. I have something, she said. Silas waited. I'll handle it, she said. Miriam? He used her name. He'd been careful not to use it before, and the fact that he said it now registered on both of them. There is an armed man at my gate who has not come here to negotiate. I know what he came here for, she said quietly, and I know how to stop it, but I need you to trust me. Silas looked at her for a long moment. This woman who had shown up on his mountain uninvited and fed his men back to health and nursed his sick and loosened something in the bunkhouse that had been rusting shut for 2 winters. Who burned the cornbread when she was frightened and didn't tell anyone she was frightened? Who had built something real in his kitchen while carrying something heavy in her chest and had never once asked him to carry any of it? What do you need? He said. She told him. Dutch did not like the plan. He said so, in the particular way he said things he didn't like. Not with argument, because argument with Silas was largely a waste of time, but with the compressed silence of a man swallowing a great deal that he would prefer to say. She wants to go out there alone, Dutch said. Yes, Silas said, to face Kane alone. Not alone, Silas said. We'll be positioned. Every man with a firearm visible. Kane needs to understand the math. Kane is a professional, Silas. He's done math before. He does math for a living. I know. And you're going to let a woman walk out there? She's not asking for permission, Silas said flatly. I'm not letting her do anything. She's decided. I'm deciding that we back her up. Dutch looked at the floor, looked at the ceiling, looked at Silas. She better know what she's doing, he said. She does, Silas said. Then, after a beat, with slightly less certainty, she does. The word went through the ranch in the quiet, efficient way that urgent things move through small communities. Not announced, not explained in full, but passed from person to person with enough information to produce the necessary response. By the time the sun had moved another hour across the sky, every man on the property knew there was a problem at the gate and knew their position and held it. Clem was on the roof of the main house with a clear line on the fence. Harker and 2 others were positioned along the south wall of the barn, visible from the gate, but protected from a direct shot. Percy. And Silas had argued about this, not with Percy but internally, because Percy was 17 and this was not what 17 should look like. But Percy had already positioned himself and Silas had decided that moving him would cost more than it gained. Percy was near the water trough, closer to the gate than anyone else, with a rifle that was almost as tall as he was. Dutch was beside Silas. Silas was at the gate. Kane had waited. He was still on the horse, still in the same position, with the same sealed patience. He watched Silas approach and his eyes moved, quickly, professionally, across the roof line, the barn wall, the positions of the men. He catalogued them without visible reaction. Mr. Granger, he said. Kane, Silas said. He stopped at the fence. The woman you're looking for is on this property. She's been on this property for 5 weeks and she's been doing honest work and she's under my protection. I want you to hear that clearly. Kane looked at the men arranged behind Silas. I hear it, he said. His voice was still reasonable, still measured. Mr. Granger, I want you to understand that I don't have any interest in your men. My business is with the woman. Any conflict that happens here is conflict that you and your people are choosing. Any conflict that happens here, Silas said, started when your employer sent you up my mountain. A silence. Kane looked at the numbers again. 11 men, at minimum, visible. Good positions. He didn't know what the firepower was exactly, but the positioning was not amateur work. Whoever had arranged them knew something about fields of fire. His jaw moved slightly, just once. I'd like to speak to her, he said. She knows, Silas said. That's her call. He turned his head just slightly, and after a moment, Miriam came through the main house door. She walked across the yard. Silas watched her walk, and he was aware, with a clarity that surprised him, of exactly what she was doing and exactly what it cost. She was not rushing. She was not performing bravery, the way some people perform it, with lifted chins and squared shoulders. She was just walking, steadily, with the same quality of movement she brought to everything, the same sense of someone who has made a decision and is executing it, and is not particularly interested in applause. She stopped beside Silas. Kane looked at her. For the first time since he'd arrived, something shifted in his expression. It was very small. A slight tightening, a recalibration. She was not what he'd expected. He'd been given a description, had constructed a mental image, and the woman standing at the gate in her wool coat with her steady eyes did not match the image in the way he'd anticipated. He couldn't have said exactly what was different. Miss Holloway, he said. Mr. Kane, she said. You know why I'm here? I do. Then you understand that this is going to be resolved, he said. The only question is how. Miriam looked at him. She had her hands in her coat pockets. Silas, standing 2 feet to her right, noticed that her hands were in her coat pockets, and he thought about what she'd told him she was carrying, and he held his position. I'd like to show you something, Miriam said. Kane's eyes dropped to her coat. His right hand moved. Not dramatically, but it moved. Slowly, he said. Of course, she said. She pulled her left hand out of her pocket. In it was a leather-bound journal, dark brown, roughly 8 inches by 5. It was worn at the corners. The leather had the particular softness of something that had been handled a great deal. She held it up so he could see it clearly. Do you know what this is? She said. Kane looked at it. Tell me. 7 years of records, she said. Financial transactions. Payments made to certain state officials in Colorado and Wyoming. Documentation of a land fraud scheme that Magnus ran between 1881 and 1884. The one that moved 3 families off their properties without legal cause. The names of the men he paid to make that happen. Amounts. Dates. She paused. Correspondence between Magnus and a building inspector in Denver who approved construction on a hotel that did not meet the requirements for safe occupancy. The hotel that caught fire in 1885. You remember the fire? Kane was very still. Everyone was very still. The wind moved across the yard and nobody paid it any attention. 4 people died in that fire, Miriam said. The inspector retired immediately after. Magnus paid for the retirement. She tilted her head slightly. It's all in here. Kane looked at the journal, then at her face. He was doing the math. Silas could see it. The same math Dutch had talked about. The professional calculation of risk and outcome. That's a serious claim, Kane said. It's a serious document, Miriam said, which is why I want you to think carefully about what Magnus Crow actually hired you to do. She lowered the journal slightly but didn't put it away. He told you this was a simple matter, a contractual dispute, a woman who took something that belonged to him. She paused. Did he tell you about the journal? Kane said nothing. No, she said. He didn't. Because if he'd told you about the journal, you would have known that what you're actually here to do is kill a government witness, which is not what you signed on for, and which carries a specific penalty in 3 territories that I suspect you're aware of. Kane's jaw tightened. I'm not a witness to anything, he said. But his voice had changed. The measured quality was still there, but there was something underneath it now, a calculation that was running faster and producing different results than the ones he'd arrived with. You're not, Miriam said. But the federal land office in Denver is. I sent them a copy 3 weeks ago, before I came up this mountain. She put the journal back in her pocket. The original is what you're looking at. If something happens to me, the copy becomes the primary document. If something happens to this ranch or anyone on it, any of these men, the federal office treats that as an act of obstruction, which means everyone involved, starting with the man who sent the message, is accountable. She looked at him steadily. Which means you. The silence stretched. Clem, on the roofline, was barely breathing. Percy, at the water trough, had his hand on the rifle and was watching Kane with the focused attention of someone very young who was working hard to appear very steady. Dutch, beside Silas, had his arms at his sides and his weight slightly forward, which was how Dutch stood when he was ready to move. Kane looked at the journal pocket, at Silas, at the men on the roofline, at Miriam's face. He was running the calculation. Silas watched him run it and felt the particular suspended quality of a moment that is about to tip in one direction or another, and held himself very still because he understood that stillness, right now, was the correct move. Kane looked at Miriam one more time. You set this up before you even got here, he said. I've had a long time to think about it, she said. Another silence. Kane reached up slowly and adjusted his hat. It was a small gesture, almost inconsequential, but Silas recognized it for what it was. A man punctuating a decision. Magnus Crow, Kane said quietly, did not tell me everything about this situation. No, Miriam said. He didn't. That's a problem for me, Kane said. Professionally. I imagine it is. He looked at her for one more long moment. Then he took his hand off the reins and turned the horse, slowly, and pointed it back toward the road that came down the mountain. He stopped once, just at the edge of the fence line. Miss Holloway, he said, without turning around. Mr. Kane. If the document is what you say it is, he paused. Magnus Crow has a lot of people working for him. Some of them are not as careful about the math as I am. I know, she said. He nodded once. Then he rode out. Nobody moved for a full 10 seconds. Then Clem let out a breath from the roofline that was loud enough to hear in the yard. Percy sat down on the edge of the water trough, which was not a deliberate decision. His legs simply made it for him. Dutch turned and looked at Silas. Silas was looking at the road where Kane had disappeared into the tree line. Then Silas turned and looked at Miriam. She was still standing at the gate. She was looking at the road too, and her hands were in her pockets, and she looked, from the side, like a woman who is holding herself very carefully together and doing it well, but who is also extremely tired. Silas walked to the gate and stood beside her. They both looked at the empty road for a moment. The Federal Land Office, Silas said. Yes, she said. You sent them a copy. A pause that lasted exactly 2 seconds. I sent them a letter, she said, asking about land filing procedures in Denver County. Silas looked at her. They sent back a standard form response, she said. I don't know anyone at the Federal Land Office. Silas stared at the road. The journal, he said. She pulled it out of her pocket, held it for a moment. Then she handed it to him. He opened it. The pages were blank. Every single one of them, from the first page to the last. Clean white paper that had never had a word written on it, inside a leather cover worn soft from years of handling. Silas stood at his own gate in the February cold and held a blank journal in his hands and felt something move through him that took him a moment to identify. It was not what he expected to feel. What he felt was something closer to awe. He closed the journal. He turned and looked at Miriam Holloway, who was watching him with the steady, tired eyes of a woman who has been carrying a very heavy thing for a very long time and has just set it down. You walked out there, he said, with a blank journal. Yes, she said, against Victor Kane. Yes. He looked at her. That was the most dangerous thing I have ever seen anyone do. She looked back at him. No, she said quietly. The most dangerous thing I ever did was stay silent while Magnus Crow took everything I built and told me to be grateful. She took the journal back from his hands. This was just talking. From the roofline, Clem was climbing down. In the yard, Harker and the others were moving away from the barn wall. Percy was still sitting on the water trough, looking at his hands. And at the gate of Iron Hollow Ranch, in the cold, thin air of a February afternoon, Silas Granger stood next to Miriam Holloway and did not know what to say, which was, for Silas Granger, an extraordinary condition. And so he said nothing. He simply stood there beside her until the last sound of Cain's horse had faded completely into the mountain below them, and the road was quiet, and the only thing left was the wind and the ranch and the people on it. The blank journal stayed in her coat pocket. The stove in the kitchen had gone untended for nearly 2 hours, and the beans were going to need attention, and there was bread that should have been started an hour ago. Miriam turned from the gate and walked back across the yard. She had work to do. The beans had burned. Not badly. Not the kind of burn that ruins everything, just the kind that catches the bottom layer and leaves a slightly bitter edge that a person has to work around. Miriam stood at the stove scraping what was salvageable into a clean pot and felt the absurdity of it with a clarity that was almost funny. She had just walked up to one of the most dangerous men in the territories with a blank journal and talked him off a mountain, and now she was standing in a kitchen worrying about burned beans. She kept scraping. The kitchen door opened behind her, and she didn't turn around because she knew the weight of the footstep. "You should sit down," Silas said. "I should fix dinner," she said. He was quiet for a moment. Then she heard him pull out a chair and sit down himself, which was its own kind of statement from a man who didn't sit in other people's spaces. "The men they're not going to be hungry for a while," he said. "Adrenaline does that." "It does," she said. "And then it wears off and they'll be ravenous. Give it an hour." She moved the salvaged beans to the back burner and started assessing what else she had. Her hands were doing the familiar work, and she let them, because familiar work was the thing that kept a person from shaking. Her hands were not shaking. She was noting that they were not shaking. "Miriam, Silas said. She turned around. He was sitting at the table with his hands flat on the surface and an expression on his face that she hadn't seen before. Not the sealed-off version of him that was most common, not the brief unguarded moment she'd caught in this same kitchen weeks ago. Something between the two. Something that was working itself out in real time. "The journal," he said. She set down the spoon. "I told you I had something," she said. "You told me that," he said. "You didn't tell me it was nothing." "It wasn't nothing," she said, and there was a firmness in her voice that surprised even her. "It was the right object in the right moment. What it had written in it was irrelevant." Silas looked at her. If he'd called the bluff, he didn't. But if he had, she met his eyes, then we would have had a different problem, and I would have dealt with that problem when it arrived. She paused. "I've been dealing with problems when they arrive for a long time, Mr. Granger. It's the problems I try to prevent in advance that tend to go sideways." He absorbed that. Then he said, "You knew Cain would fold." "I knew Cain was a rational man," she said carefully. "Rational men who do dangerous work stay alive by being very specific about what they're paid to do and what they're not paid to do. Magnus told him this was a retrieval, a civil matter, no complications." She sat down across from him because her legs had been making a case for sitting for several minutes and she'd been ignoring them. "The moment I introduced the idea of federal documentation and criminal accountability, the job changed shape. Cain had to decide whether the original fee was worth the new shape of the job. And you bet your life he'd decide it wasn't. I made an educated assessment," she said, "based on everything I knew about how he works and how Magnus operates and what kind of man Magnus would hire." She looked at her hands on the table. "Magnus is careful about who he hires. He hires people who do the job he describes. He doesn't tell them about complications because he doesn't believe complications are real until they are. He thought this was a simple job because he thought I was simple." "He was wrong," Silas said. "He's been wrong about me for 10 years, she said. "I've just been in positions where being right about it didn't help me any." The kitchen was quiet. Outside, voices were beginning to move around the yard. The ranch hands processing what had just happened in the way that groups of men process things, which mostly involved talking loudly and retelling the story to each other with minor variations in the retelling. Through the wall, they could hear Clem's voice, elevated, describing the moment Cain turned his horse. The description had already acquired details that Clem had not been positioned to see. Miriam listened to it, and something moved across her face that wasn't quite a smile but was related to one. "He's already making it bigger," she said. They all are, Silas said. He was watching her. Let them. She looked at him. You earned it, he said simply. Let them make it bigger. Dutch came in 20 minutes later and stood in the kitchen doorway with his arms folded and the expression of a man who has been carrying a great deal of tension and is in the process of setting it down, which is its own uncomfortable feeling. Kane is down the east switchback, he said. Parker tracked him from the ridge. He's not stopping. He won't come back, Miriam said. Dutch looked at her. You're sure? His professional reputation depends on reading situations correctly. Coming back after walking away would mean he misread it twice. He won't do that. Dutch unfolded his arms, refolded them. He was working through something. The journal, he said. Dutch, Silas said. I just want to understand. Dutch. Dutch looked at Silas, then at Miriam, then back at the floor. All right, he said finally. All right. He was quiet for a moment. That took more nerve than I've got. You don't know that, Miriam said. I do know that, Dutch said. I've tested my nerve on a number of occasions, and I have a reasonable estimate of its limits. What you did is above my limit. He said it without particular emotion, like he was reporting a measurement. Then he turned and walked back out. Miriam watched the empty doorway for a moment. Then she got up and went back to the stove, because Dutch had been right about one thing. In about 40 minutes, 11 men were going to be extremely hungry. She was right about the hour. They came in shifts. Some hungry, some not yet, but eating anyway because the smell reached them before their appetite did. The kitchen filled up in the way it had been filling up for weeks now, with bodies arranged in the casual geometry of people who are comfortable in a space, and the noise was different from the noise of a normal meal. It was louder and less organized, and several conversations were happening simultaneously, and Clem told the story of Kane on the horse 3 times to 3 different configurations of listeners. Percy ate 2 bowls and didn't say much. Miriam noticed his quiet. She noticed Percy's quiet the way she noticed most things, from the side, without making it obvious. He sat slightly apart from the louder conversation, which was unusual for him, and he ate with the focused attention of someone who is chewing over something that isn't food. She got herself a bowl. She rarely ate with the men, usually ate standing at the stove or after everyone else had gone, and sat down near Percy. Not next to him, not close enough to invite conversation, just near enough to make it available. He let it sit for a few minutes. Then he said, "Were you scared?" She considered the question honestly. "Yes." "You didn't look it." "That's different from not being it," she said. He thought about that. How do you do that? Look like you're not when you are?" She looked at her bowl. "You just decide that the looking is separate from the feeling. The feeling is yours. The looking is for whoever you're dealing with." She paused. "It gets easier, not the fear part. That doesn't change much, but the separation between feeling it and showing it, that you can practice." Percy was quiet. "You did well today," she said, "staying at the trough." "My legs were shaking," he said. "That's just blood moving to where your body thinks you might need it," she said. "It's not weakness. It's preparation." He looked at her sideways. "Where'd you learn that?" "Woman who cooked at a mining camp in Nevada," she said. She'd seen a lot of difficult situations. She had a lot of opinions about the difference between being afraid and being a coward. "What's the difference?" "Being afraid is involuntary," Miriam said. "The other one is a choice." Percy ate another spoonful. Then he said, "I thought he was going to shoot you." "So did I," she said. He stopped eating and looked at her. "About a 30% chance he'd decide the risk wasn't calculable and remove the variable," she said. "That's what I thought, standing there." She met his eyes. "I thought it was worth the 30%. Percy stared at her. "Miss Miriam," he said, "you are the most terrifying person I have ever met." She smiled then, fully, which was rare enough that Percy would remember it later. "Good," she said. "That'll be useful." Poem. The night settled into something quieter than the day had been. The celebration, such as it was wound down by the time the cold really set in and the stove needed banking and the bodies needed sleep. Men filed out of the kitchen in ones and twos, and the voices in the yard gradually stilled. And eventually it was just the empty kitchen and the banked fire and the sound of wind doing what wind did on that mountain every night. Miriam cleaned up. She did it alone, which was how she preferred it. Not because she was territorial about the kitchen, but because cleaning up was the part of the day where she could think without managing anyone else's presence. She washed the pots and stacked them and wiped the table and swept the floor. And while she did it, she thought about Victor Kane riding down the mountain, about what he'd said before he left. Magnus Crow has a lot of people working for him. Some of them are not as careful about the math as I am. She had heard it. She had not let him see that she had heard it. But she had. Kane going away was not the same as Magnus stopping. Magnus would be furious. The particular cold, calculated fury of a man who had been outmaneuvered by someone he'd written off as inconsequential. The blank journal was a weapon she could only use once. The Federal Land Office letter was a fiction. The protection she'd built around herself today was real only as long as it took Magnus to do the math himself and find the seams in it. She needed something real. She had been thinking about what real looked like for a long time, and the shape of it was clearer to her now than it had been in Denver. But clarity and capacity were two different things. Knowing what she needed was not the same as having it. She finished sweeping and put the broom away and stood in the middle of the kitchen for a moment. Then she went to the small table in the corner where she kept her personal items, the leather satchel, the cast iron pot, and underneath those, in the inner pocket of the satchel, a small notebook that was not blank. It was not the ledger she'd described to Kane. It was not a document of Magnus's crimes. She had no access to his financial records. Had never had that access. Had been careful enough of him when she left Denver that she'd taken nothing that could be legally contested. What she had was something different. Smaller in some ways, more valuable in others. It was a collection of letters. 12 of them, in her own handwriting, addressed and stamped and ready to send, written over the previous 4 months whenever she'd had access to pen and paper and the privacy to use them. They were addressed to various people. A food editor at a Denver newspaper who had written admiringly about the culinary scene at Magnus's hotels. A former colleague who now worked in a different city and had no love for Magnus. A woman named Frances Alcott, who ran a boarding house in Cheyenne and had witnessed, though she didn't know what she'd witnessed, a meeting between Magnus and a city official that Miriam had been present for. The letters were careful. They were specific. They described what she knew, what she'd seen, what she could substantiate from memory and from her own experience. They were not the kind of evidence that would stand up in a formal legal proceeding, but they were the kind of evidence that, distributed across a dozen different hands in a dozen different places, would make Magnus Crow's name into a conversation he could not control. She had been waiting for the right moment to send them. She sat down at the small table and looked at the stack of letters and thought about what Kane had said and decided that the right moment was now. She would ask Silas to include them in the next supply dispatch going down the mountain. That was the real weapon, not the blank journal, not the improvised bluff. This, a dozen letters going in a dozen directions, creating a noise that Magnus could silence individually but not collectively. She put the letters back in the satchel and went to bed. By Tom. She told Silas the next morning. He was at his desk when she knocked. She knocked, which she was aware was something she'd begun to do, and which felt important without her being entirely sure why. And he said, "Come in," and she came in and sat across from him at the desk the way she'd sat across from him at the kitchen table, and she told him about the letters. He listened. He was a good listener when he chose to be, which was not something Miriam had anticipated about him. She had anticipated a man who listened the way some men listen, waiting for the other person to finish so they could speak. But Silas listened with the focused attention of someone who is actually changing the shape of what he knows based on what he's hearing. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. 12 letters, he said. 12, she said. Different recipients, different angles on the same information. Some of them know more than others. Some of them may not do anything with what I've sent them, but enough of them will. You've had these ready. Since November, she said. He looked at her. You've been carrying those letters up this mountain. Yes. While you were cooking and nursing Walt and Briggs and talking Clem and Harker off each other's throats. He said it without particular inflection, just a cataloging. People need to eat, she said. That doesn't stop because I have other problems. He shook his head slowly. Not negatively, just the movement of a man absorbing something. The next supply run goes down in 4 days, he said. Ryder takes mail from the ranch to Bitter Creek. It goes on the stage from there. He paused. Is Bitter Creek safe? Given Dellard. She hadn't known Dellard's name until the previous evening, when Dutch had quietly told her the shape of how Kane had known where to come. She had sat with that for an hour before she'd been able to speak normally again. Not because it was surprising, exactly, but because betrayal never fully lost its capacity to land. Dellard's already been paid, she said. He has no reason to stay involved. Men who've been paid to do one thing have been known to find other opportunities, Silas said. True, she said, but Dellard he's a grievance man, not an enterprise man. He didn't do this because he had a plan. He did it because someone offered him money while he was angry. The anger and the money are both spent now. Silas considered that. You read people the way I read terrain, he said. It's the same thing, she said. You look at what's there and you ask what it's likely to do under pressure. He looked at her for a moment. Then he opened the top drawer of his desk and took out a folded piece of paper and pushed it across the desk to her. She looked at it without touching it. What is this? Open it. She picked it up and unfolded it. It was a letter, handwritten in Silas's own hand. The handwriting was angular and deliberate, the writing of a man who didn't do it often but did it carefully when he did. It was addressed to a man named Amos Whitfield, attorney, Denver. She read it. It took her a moment to understand what she was reading, and then it took her another moment to be sure she was understanding it correctly. You wrote to a lawyer, she said. I wrote to my lawyer, Silas said. Amos and I have done business for 15 years. I've sent him a description of your situation, your real situation, the history with Crow, what you told me, what happened yesterday. I've asked him to look into the legal standing of your claim on the recipes and the methods. He paused. He's good. He's discreet. And he has a fairly significant appetite for cases that involve wealthy men doing things that wealthy men shouldn't be allowed to do. Miriam looked at the letter, at Silas's handwriting. When did you write this? She said. Last night, he said. After the kitchen went quiet. She sat with that for a moment. You didn't tell me, she said. I didn't know if it would come to anything, he said. I didn't want to offer you something I couldn't deliver. She set the letter down. She looked at the surface of the desk, the worn wood, the ink stains, the small practical objects of a man who worked in this space daily. She was looking at the desk because looking at his face right now required more composure than she was certain she had. Silas, she said. You don't have to do this alone, he said. His voice was not gentle exactly. It was not a voice that did gentle easily, but it was careful in a way that meant the same thing. You've been doing it alone by your account, for years, and you're good at it. But being good at something alone doesn't mean the alone part is necessary. She looked up at him. There was a long moment. The letters, she said, and Amos Whitfield. And whatever else needs doing, he said. She folded the letter and set it back on his desk. I'll need to add some detail to what you've written him. Things I haven't told you yet. History I haven't... She stopped. I'm not going anywhere, Silas said. She nodded once, slowly. 4 days to the supply run, she said. 4 days, he confirmed. She stood up. She straightened her coat in the small automatic way she had, a habit from years of presenting herself to rooms that hadn't expected her and had formed opinions before she got there. I'll need paper, she said, and time. You have both, he said. She went to the door, then she stopped. The blank journal, she said without turning around. I want you to keep it. He said nothing. I carried it from Denver because I thought it might be useful one day and I couldn't have told you exactly how. It was a tool waiting for the right problem. She paused. It found one, but I don't want it back. I don't want to be a person who carries a blank journal anymore. He still said nothing. I'd rather be a person who writes things down, she said. She heard him stand up from the desk. She heard him cross to the small shelf on the east wall where he kept things that were not strictly practical, but that he kept anyway. A river stone, a folded piece of cloth that she'd never asked about, a small photograph that faced the wall. She heard him set the journal down on that shelf. She walked out and pulled the door closed behind her. The 4 days between that morning and the supply run were not quiet days. They were not dramatic in the way the day of Kane's visit had been dramatic, but they had a particular quality of suspended animation, everything proceeding normally on the surface while underneath it, something was shifting and setting and taking on a new shape. The men felt it without being able to name it. They ate and worked and argued about the south barn roof and played cards in the evenings, but there was a different texture to it, as if the air pressure had changed slightly and they hadn't fully adjusted yet. Clem's retelling of the Kane story had by this point evolved to include atmospheric details that bore a creative relationship with the actual events. In his current version, Kane had been visibly shaken by the sight of Miriam at the gate. Percy, who had been close enough to see Kane's face clearly, did not correct this. He had decided that Clem's version was good for the group's morale, and that accuracy, in this particular instance, was less important than the story's function. Miriam spent the evenings at the small table with paper, writing. Not letters this time. Or not only letters. She was writing down everything. The complete account, from the beginning, the 10 years of work, the precise nature of what she'd developed and when, the moment she'd realized what Magnus had done and what she'd done in response, the subsequent years, the threats, the flight, the mountain. She wrote with the focused effort of someone who has been keeping something inside for so long that getting it out requires physical as well as mental attention. She was not a natural writer. She thought in other textures, in flavors and temperatures and the weight of a pan. But she was a precise woman, and she brought the same precision to the page that she brought to everything. She crossed things out and rewrote them and occasionally held a paragraph up to the lamp and decided it was wrong and started it again. On the third evening, Silas came to the kitchen door and knocked, as he had taken to doing. She told him to come in. He brought 2 cups of coffee, which was notable because Silas did not make coffee for other people, as a general rule, and he sat down across from her and looked at the pages spread out on the table. "That's a lot," he said. 10 years is a lot," she said. She picked up her coffee. It was good. Better than she'd made him credit for from a man who she'd assumed was indifferent to such things. She said so. He looked at the cup with mild surprise. "My mother made it strong," he said. "I never changed the habit." It was the first time he'd mentioned her to Miriam directly. Not the memory of her, not the indirect approach of a feeling crossing his face, the direct mention, simple and unguarded. Miriam said, "What was her name?" He was quiet for a moment. "June," he said. "June Granger. Born June Caldwell, but she went by Granger from the day she got married and never looked back." "She was strong," Miriam said. It was not a question. "She was whatever the situation required," Silas said. "When the situation required soft, she was soft. When it required something else to—" He stopped. Then he said, "She made beans the way you make beans, that spicing, whatever that is you do." "Dried chilies and timing," Miriam said, "and a little cornmeal to thicken. It was a woman in Missouri who showed me." "Missouri," he said. "I spent 2 winters there when I was first starting out," she said. "Before Denver, before everything." He looked at the pages again. "What will you do?" he said. "After Whitfield gets involved. After this is—" He stopped. He was not good at the speculative, she'd noticed. He liked what was in front of him. "I don't know yet," she said honestly. "You could stay," he said. He said it the way he said most things, directly, without embellishment, without trying to soften it into something more comfortable. Just the words, sitting in the room. "Through the season," she said. He was quiet for a beat. Longer than the season. Miriam looked at the coffee cup. The fire in the stove was steady. The pages were spread out on the table between them, and the window showed a sky that had, for the first time in several weeks, cleared enough to show stars. "Ask me again," she said, "when we know how the letters land." He nodded once. The nod of a man who accepts a conditional answer because it is an honest one, and he values honesty above comfort. "Fair enough," he said. They sat in the kitchen for another hour, not always talking, the pages between them, the fire keeping the cold outside where it belonged. At some point, Miriam reached across and moved a few pages to show him a particular section, and he read it slowly and carefully and asked two questions about specific details, and she answered them, and he nodded, and it was one of the most ordinary things that had happened in that kitchen. There was also something else. Neither of them named it. Naming it would have been premature, and they were both people who preferred precision to premature naming. But something was being written, on those pages and in the room around them, in the slow accumulation of evenings and coffee and steadiness, and the particular quality of two people who have seen each other at their worst and found the other person still worth sitting across a table from. Outside the window, the stars were very clear. The road from the North Pass had been empty for 4 days. In 4 days, the letters would go down the mountain, Amos Whitfield in Denver would open an envelope, and something that had been waiting a long time would begin to move. Miriam gathered the pages into a careful stack and set them aside and stood up to check the fire. The beans for tomorrow were already soaking. She had learned a long time ago that the best meals required preparation you couldn't see. The work you did in the quiet, before anyone arrived, before anyone was watching, that was what made the difference between something that sustained people and something that merely fed them. She had spent 10 years learning that lesson in kitchens. She was beginning to understand it applied to other things too. The letters went down the mountain on a Thursday morning, tucked into a canvas satchel strapped behind the supply rider's saddle alongside Silas's letter to Amos Whitfield and 3 weeks of outgoing ranch correspondence. Miriam watched the rider go from the kitchen window. She watched until he disappeared around the first switchback and the road was empty again, and then she turned back to the stove because the oatmeal was threatening to stick, and threatened oatmeal required attention. That was the thing about sending something irreversible out into the world. The world did not pause to acknowledge it. The oatmeal still needed stirring, the fire still needed managing. Percy still came through the door 20 minutes later, asking if there was coffee, and there was, and life continued in its ordinary direction while somewhere down the mountain a canvas satchel carried 12 letters toward 12 different destinations and one attorney's office in Denver. She had done what she could do. Now she waited. Waiting was, in some ways, harder than the blank journal. The blank journal had required nerve in a single concentrated moment. Waiting required a different kind of nerve, the sustained, low-grade kind that didn't announce itself as courage, but wore you down just as effectively if you let it. Miriam did not let it. Or she tried not to let it, which was the honest version. She cooked. She maintained the kitchen. She checked on the south barn repair, which had finally begun now that Silas had conceded the roof could not be reasoned with. And she brought the work crew hot coffee at mid-morning without being asked because she'd noticed that men worked better when someone acknowledged that they existed. She sat with Percy in the early mornings when he couldn't sleep, which was still often, though the sickness was long gone and the restlessness was something else. 17, trying to become 18, she thought. All that energy with nowhere certain to go. She did not check the road every hour. She checked it in the morning and at dusk, and in between she kept her eyes on what was in front of her, which had always been her method, and which had served her adequately, if not perfectly, over a long number of years. Amos Whitfield's first response arrived 19 days later. The supply rider came back up the mountain with provisions and a sealed envelope addressed to Silas, and Silas brought it to Miriam without opening it, which told her something about the kind of man he was, that he'd written to his attorney on her behalf and then handed the response directly to her without reading it first. There was a trust in that gesture that she was not entirely sure she'd earned and was not going to waste. She opened it at the kitchen table with Silas sitting across from her. Whitfield's handwriting was a lawyer's handwriting, precise, slightly cramped, the writing of a man accustomed to being held to his exact words. The letter was 2 pages. She read it through once quickly, then again slowly. "Well," she said. "Good or bad," Silas said. He was watching her face, which by now he'd learned to read in the particular way you learn to read something you've been paying close attention to. "Both," she said. She set the first page down. "He says the claim on the recipes themselves is complicated. Food recipes are not straightforwardly protected. He says there are arguments to be made, but they're not the strongest ground." She paused. "However," she lifted the second page, "he says 3 of the people I wrote to have already contacted him, independently. Two of them have information he considers significant. She looked up. Frances Alcott, the woman in Cheyenne who witnessed the meeting, she wrote down what she saw at the time, in a journal, a real one. A small pause on those last two words. She never connected it to anything, but Whitfield says combined with my account and the dates I provided, it establishes a pattern of conduct that gives him somewhere to stand. Silas was quiet for a moment. What does he need from you? A formal statement, she said, witnessed and signed, and he wants me to come to Denver. The kitchen was quiet. Denver, Silas said. That's where Whitfield is, she said, and where the people he needs to talk to are, and where she stopped. Where Magnus is. Silas nodded slowly. When, he said. When the pass clears, she said. He says there's no urgency on his end. He needs time to prepare. He'll wait for spring. She put the letter down on the table and looked at it. Spring. It was currently the third week of February. Spring on this mountain was not a near thing. It was a concept, a direction, a promise the weather had not yet committed to keeping. That's 2 months, Silas said. At least, she said. He looked at the letter, then at her. All right, he said. Just that. Not a question, not a negotiation, an acceptance of a timeline he hadn't chosen and couldn't change. She looked at him across the table. This man who knocked on his own kitchen door, who had loaded his rifle without being asked and stood at his fence line without hesitation, who had written to his lawyer and handed her the response unopened. You don't have to wait, she said carefully, for whatever. I know this has complicated your operation, brought problems to your property. You didn't ask for any of it. Silas gave her a look that was somewhere between impatient and amused, which was as close to amused as his face generally got. I asked you to stay after the first meal, he said. Everything that came after was part of the same decision. You didn't know what came after, she said. No, he said. You never do. He picked up his coffee. That's not a reason to make a different decision. March arrived and the snow did not stop, but the quality of it changed. It became wetter, heavier, the kind of snow that was working toward something, that had spring in it somewhere, even if spring itself was still weeks away. The days got longer by the particular increments that people on isolated ranches track carefully, because light was not just a comfort but a practical resource, and more of it meant more work could be done. The south barn roof was finished by the second week of March. It had taken 3 weeks and considerable argument in 2 moments where Silas and Dutch had nearly come to a genuine falling out over the method, but it was done, and it was solid, and the first night after completion it snowed 8 inches, and not a single flake came through. Dutch stood in the barn the next morning, looking up at the ceiling with the expression of a man who has been proven right but will not say so, because the person he was right against was Silas Granger, and some victories were better savored privately. Miriam brought them both coffee. Dutch said, You heard we finished the roof. I heard, she said. Good work, he said, into his coffee cup. It is, she said. Silas picked the wrong method initially, Dutch said. Dutch, she said, I'm just saying. I know what you're saying, she said, and you're probably right, and that's going to have to be enough for you. Dutch looked at her sideways. Then he drank his coffee and went back to work, and Miriam could hear him not quite smiling as he went. It was Percy who noticed the change in the wider world before anyone else did. He noticed it because he'd started writing letters himself. To his sister in Nebraska, initially, which he hadn't told anyone about, and Miriam hadn't mentioned, though she'd seen the paper and the careful handwriting through the kitchen window one evening and understood what she was looking at. Then to a friend from his hometown, then, apparently, to a few people whose connection to Percy wasn't entirely clear. What this meant was that Percy was receiving letters back, and one of those letters, arriving in the second week of March, contained something that Percy brought to Miriam with an expression that she'd learned to read as significant without being readable. He handed her the letter without explanation. It was from his friend in Bitter Creek. It was mostly ordinary, local news, weather, complaints about delivery rates. But in the third paragraph, almost as an aside, the friend mentioned that there had been a notable development in Denver. that Magnus Crow's name had been appearing in certain newspapers in connection with a land dispute case that a Denver attorney had filed on behalf of an unnamed party, that the newspapers were using words like irregularities and inquiry, which were the words newspapers used when they knew more than they could yet print. Miriam read it twice. Then she sat down. She had not expected it to move this fast. She had told herself it would take months, that Whitfield was a good attorney, but that legal processes moved like winter rivers, slow and grinding. She had prepared herself for a long patience. She had not prepared herself for it working. "Is this good?" Percy said. He was watching her face with the careful attention he'd developed over months of reading a woman who didn't always show what she felt. "Yes," she said. "This is good." "How good?" She looked at the letter, the kind of good that means other people are looking now, not just Whitfield. When journalists start using words like irregularities, it means someone has been talking to them, which means the letters reached people who made other calls, who called other people. She set the letter down. Cockroaches scatter when the light comes on. Magnus is going to be very busy managing his reputation. Percy absorbed this. So he can't send anyone else. He could, she said, but the calculation has changed. Sending someone else now, when his name is already in newspapers, would be the action of a man who is panicking. Magnus does not panic visibly. He won't do anything that confirms what people are starting to think about him. Percy let out a breath. It was the breath of someone who has been holding tension in a specific location for a specific amount of time and has just been told they can release it. "Good," he said, "because I was—" He stopped. "You were worried," she said. "I was very worried," he said, with the directness of someone who has decided honesty is less exhausting than the alternative. "So was I," she said. "I was very worried too." He looked at her. "You didn't show it." "I know," she said. "I'm sorry about that." He seemed surprised that she'd apologized. He thought about it for a moment. "No," he said finally. "No, I think if you'd shown it, the rest of us would have been too scared to function." He paused. "So maybe don't apologize." She looked at him, 17 going on something older. Something that had been forged in a winter that was not easy and had come out a different shape than it started. "You've grown up this winter," she said. He shrugged, a little uncomfortable. "Everybody grew up something." She handed the letter back to him. "Go show Dutch," she said. "He'll want to know." Silas heard the news from Dutch, who heard it from Percy, which meant by the time it reached Silas, it had been filtered through 2 different temperaments and had picked up a slightly different texture at each stage. Dutch's version was cautious, good news with conditions and caveats, the way Dutch processed everything. Percy's version, which Dutch relayed as a secondary account, was more direct. Silas came to find Miriam that evening. She was in the kitchen. She was always in the kitchen. But this time she had made something that was not practical. She had made a cake, an actual cake, from cornmeal and dried fruit that had been in the pantry for weeks, and bear fat, and the last of a small amount of actual sugar she'd been rationing since January. It was not a pretty cake. It was dense and slightly lopsided, and the dried fruit had settled unevenly, and it looked, honestly, like something produced by good intentions under difficult conditions, which was exactly what it was. Silas looked at it. "What's the occasion?" he said. "I thought there should be one," she said. He looked at her face. She was not performing cheerfulness. Miriam did not perform emotions. It was one of the things he had come to rely on about her. What was on her face was something more complicated and more real. Relief with edges. The particular expression of someone who has been braced for impact for so long that the absence of impact requires its own adjustment. "Whitfield is working," he said. "He's working," she confirmed. "And other people are working. And Magnus—" She paused. "Magnus is dealing with something he can't buy his way out of. You can buy silence. You can buy compliance. You can't buy the fact that people are already talking." Silas pulled out a chair and sat down. "So it's over," he said. She was quiet for a moment. "The danger part might be over," she said. "The rest of it, the legal piece, getting formal recognition of what was mine, that still takes time. I still have to go to Denver. I know, he said. I still have to stand in front of people and say it out loud with my name attached to it, she said, which is not the same as sending letters anonymously. That's... She stopped, and there was something in the stopping that was honest in a way she didn't usually let herself be. That's harder in some ways. Standing in a room and saying, this was mine, and it was taken, and I am here to say it mattered. Silas looked at her. It mattered, he said. It matters. She nodded, very slightly. Will you cut that cake, he said, or did you make it to look at? She almost laughed. It came out as something shorter and quieter than a laugh, but it was in the family. She cut the cake. She served it to the men that night after dinner, without explanation. Clem asked what the occasion was, and she said she thought they deserved something sweet, which was true enough. The cake was eaten with the unsentimental appreciation of hungry men who did not require a narrative to enjoy dessert. But later, after the kitchen had cleared, Dutch lingered. He was bad at lingering. It did not come naturally to him, and he executed it with the visible discomfort of a man performing an action he had decided on intellectually but not yet emotionally. He stood near the stove with his cup and didn't quite look at her and didn't quite leave. Dutch, she said finally. What? He looked at the cup. I owe you something, he said. You don't. I do, he said. When you first got here, I told Silas you wouldn't last the week. He said it with the flatness of someone who has decided that honesty, in this instance, is what the moment requires, even if it's uncomfortable to deliver. I said you were the wrong kind of person for this kind of place. Miriam looked at him. What kind of person did you think I was? She said. Soft, he said. I thought you'd need things. I thought you'd complain. I thought you'd be a problem in a place that already had enough problems. He finally looked up. I was wrong. You were making a reasonable assessment with limited information, she said. I was making assumptions, he said. That's different. She looked at him for a moment. Dutch, who had been running cattle operations for 20 years and who had told her the truth about himself with the same direct economy he brought to everything. Apology accepted, she said. For what it's worth. I've been underestimated my whole life. You're not the worst version of it. That's not a very high bar, he said. No, she said. It isn't. She picked up her own cup. But you stood at that barn wall when Cain came. You positioned the men. You did what needed doing without being told and without asking questions. She looked at him. That counts. Dutch nodded once. He put down the cup and walked to the door. Then he stopped, because something was apparently not quite finished. Silas is going to ask you to stay, he said, to the door rather than to her. She said nothing. Not just through the season, Dutch said. He's going to ask you properly. I don't know when. He's working up to it in the way he works up to things, which takes a while. A pause. I'm not interfering. I just thought you should know it's coming, so you have time to think about it without him standing in front of you waiting for the answer. He went out before she could respond. She stood in the kitchen alone for a long time after that. The pass cleared in the second week of April. Not fully. The high mountain passes were not fully clear until late May at the earliest, and even then the word clear was optimistic. But clear enough that travel was possible for someone who was careful and had a good horse and was not in a hurry. Miriam left Iron Hollow Ranch on an April morning with her weathered satchel and her cast iron pot in the pages she'd written, now organized into the kind of document that Whitfield had told her he needed. She left at first light, which was her way. She had said her goodbyes the evening before, which she'd done quietly and individually rather than as a group event, because she found group events of that kind required a performance of feeling rather than the feeling itself, and she preferred the real version. Percy she'd talked to for nearly an hour, which surprised them both. She told him things that she hoped would be useful, about the separation between fear and action, about the value of staying in places long enough to understand them before deciding they weren't for you, about writing letters to people you'd lost touch with because 4 years of silence was always reversible until it wasn't. He'd listened with the focused attention he'd developed over the winter, and then he'd said, in his direct 17-year-old way, that he hoped she'd come back, and she'd told him honestly that she hoped so too. Dutch she'd simply shaken hands with, which was what the situation called for, and what they both knew it called for. She went to find Silas in the early evening, which was when he was usually at the desk in his office, not quite finishing the work he'd meant to finish. He was at the desk. She knocked. He said, "Come in." She sat across from him, which was their arrangement, which had started as a practical matter and had become something else over months of evenings and coffee and pages spread across surfaces between them. "I leave in the morning," she said. "I know," he said. "Whitfield thinks the formal process will take another 2 or 3 months," she said. "There may be depositions. There will definitely be a period where I'm occupied with things that are not cooking." "I understand," he said. "After that—" She stopped. He waited. "After that," she said, "I don't know what I'm going back to. I've been running long enough that I'm not sure what it looks like to stand still somewhere, to build something again, in a place with—" She stopped again. She was usually more articulate than this. She was finding, in this particular conversation, that articulate was harder to sustain. "With people," Silas said. "Yes," she said, "with people." He looked at her across the desk. This woman who had appeared out of a blizzard with a cast-iron pot and 1 hour to prove herself, and had ended up being the axis around which something important had quietly turned. Who had nursed his sick men and managed his difficult ones, and faced down a professional killer with a blank journal, and never once asked him to treat her as anything other than a person doing a job. "I asked you before," he said, "and you told me to ask again when the letters landed." "The letters landed," she said. "They did," he said. "So I'm asking." She looked at him, at the angular handwriting on the desk around him, the accounts, the correspondence, the ongoing management of a place that was difficult and real and not particularly romantic, except in the way that anything difficult and real eventually becomes, when you understand what it cost. At the shelf on the east wall where the blank journal sat between the river stone and the folded cloth. "I'm not the same person I was when I came up this mountain," she said. "I want to be clear about that. I was carrying something then that I've set down. I don't know exactly what I am without it." "Nobody does," Silas said. "When you put something down you've been carrying a long time, it takes a while to know what shape you are without it." She looked at him. He was not a man who said things like that easily, and the fact that he'd said it meant he'd thought it, and the fact that he'd thought it meant he understood something she hadn't expected him to understand. "Ask me again," she said, "when I come back from Denver." He held her gaze for a moment. "When?" he said. "Not if." The distinction was deliberate. "When?" she confirmed. He nodded once. She stood up. She straightened her coat. "The beans," she said. He looked slightly thrown by the subject change. "What about them?" "The dried ones in the large sack on the left side of the pantry. They need to be used in the next 2 weeks or they'll go mealy. Don't let whoever cooks while I'm gone ignore them." She paused. "And the rosemary jar needs to be kept away from the moisture near the back wall, or you'll lose what's left of it." He was looking at her with an expression that she had come to know well over these months, the expression of a man who is both exasperated and something that was not quite the opposite of exasperated, but was related to it. "I'll pass that along," he said. "Good," she said. She walked to the door. "Miriam," he said. She turned. "Come back," he said. Simple as that. 2 words with no decoration around them, which was the only way Silas Granger knew how to say important things. "I'm planning on it," she said. She went out into the evening. The air was cold, but it had a different quality than February cold. It had given it, a slight yielding, the cold of a season that was ending rather than a season in its full force. The road down from the pass was visible in the last light, winding through the trees, leading to a world that had been rearranged in her absence and was about to be rearranged further. She stood outside for a moment and breathed it in. There was a version of her life, she knew, where this was not the story, where she had stayed quiet, where Magnus's money and power had been the final word, because money and power were frequently the final word, and the people who decided otherwise often paid a price that wasn't worth it. She had paid a price. Years of running, years of careful and exhausting vigilance, years of carrying a blank journal and hoping it would be enough. But there was another accounting. She had climbed a mountain in a blizzard with a cast iron pot and proved herself in an hour. She had cooked 11 men back to health and held a community together through a winter that wanted to break it. She had faced a professional hunter at a fence line and made him turn his horse around using nothing but the truth about what she'd already set in motion and a lie about what she held in her hands. She had written 12 letters that had found 12 people who had found 12 different ways to pull a thread. And the thing that Magnus had built on her silence was beginning to come apart at the seams. None of it was clean. None of it was certain. Denver was still ahead of her, and Whitfield's process was not guaranteed, and the world had a long history of deciding that women without institutional power were not worth the fight. But she was going anyway. Because the alternative was a smaller life, and she had never, not in 10 years of being told to make herself smaller, to be grateful, to understand her position, she had never once actually believed that smaller was what she deserved. She went inside and finished her packing. The cast iron pot she left on the stove. It was hers, and it would be here when she came back, and some things you could afford to leave in a place because you knew you were returning to them. That was, she decided, as close to peace as she was likely to get tonight. It was enough. She went to sleep, and in the morning she went down the mountain, and behind her Iron Hollow ranch sat in the April cold with its patched roof and its banked fires, and its 11 men who had been, without quite noticing when it happened, made into something more than a collection of bodies doing work in the same location. The cast iron pot sat on the stove. The blank journal sat on the shelf. And the road back up the mountain was there, as it had always been, waiting for someone willing to climb it.